She smelled it before she understood what it meant: pine resin, cold timber, and 40 years of rain through a roof nobody had bothered to fix. One sheet of paper, 14 acres, a cabin abandoned since 1994. Her husband of 38 years had just been awarded the house, the cars, and the future they'd built together. His lawyer called the cabin a gesture of goodwill. Gerald smiled when he said it. Dorothy was already looking at the door. She was 63 years old. She had nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. And inside that cabin, behind a wall that had been sealed for over 100 years, something was waiting. Not for just anyone. For exactly her. The judge had kind eyes. Dorothy noticed that, and then noticed it didn't help. She was sitting on the left side of the courtroom. Alone. The court-appointed advocate beside her had reviewed her case for 40 minutes the previous Thursday. This morning he had spent most of the hearing with his phone under the table. The room smelled of old wood and floor wax, and the particular stillness of a place where people come to lose things. Across the aisle, Gerald sat with 3 people in suits: his lead attorney, a paralegal with a leather binder, and Simone, 31 years old, in a dress the color of champagne that cost more than Dorothy's monthly grocery budget. Simone had her hand on Gerald's forearm. Not for him, for the room. Dorothy was wearing the navy blazer she had bought for Nora's college graduation. 19 years ago. It still fit. She had not thought about that until this exact moment, and she did not know why it mattered, only that it did. The judge began reading. The house went to Gerald. The cars. The retirement accounts, 31 years of careful saving, his name primary on every document. 5 years of alimony. Sufficient time, the judge said, to re-establish financial independence. He said it the way people say things they are required to say. Dorothy kept her hands in her lap. Still. Then Gerald's attorney cleared his throat. One additional asset, he said. A property in Black Ridge Valley, Montana. 14 acres. A log cabin structure present but uninhabitable, no utilities connected, last assessed in 1994 at negligible value. Abandoned for 30 years. He called it a gesture of goodwill. Gerald turned his head slightly toward his attorney. A small movement. His attorney glanced back. Between them passed something that did not require expression, a shared understanding, unhurried and satisfied, the kind that belongs to people who believe they have already won. Dorothy did not look at them. She was looking at the deed the clerk had placed in front of her. One sheet of paper, standard weight. The corners sharp and precise, the corners of a document printed by someone for whom this was just a Tuesday. She picked it up. At the top, Black Ridge County Recorder's Office. Below that, coordinates instead of a street address. Below that, a single typed notation, structure present, uninhabitable. Last inspected, 1994. 30 years ago, someone had looked at this property, written those 3 words, and walked away. The gavel came down. Dorothy folded the deed along the crease it already had. Neat corners. The way she had always done things, letters, permission slips, the small pieces of paper that hold a life together without anyone noticing. She stood. Put the deed in her coat pocket. Her footsteps on the courtroom floor were even, unhurried, not slow enough to be deliberate, not fast enough to be escape. She did not look back at Gerald. She did not look back at Simone. She pushed through the door and walked into the November air and got into her car and sat down. She did not start the engine. The deed was in her coat pocket. She took it out and set it on her lap. Around her, the parking lot slowly emptied. Other people's cases concluded. Other people's Tuesdays continuing. The light through the windshield was flat and pale, the way November light is arriving, without warmth, illuminating, without mercy. It moved across the deed on her lap. It moved across her hands. 38 years. She did not cry. Not here. The deed listed no street address, just coordinates and a single typed note structure present uninhabitable last inspected 1994. She folded it one more time and sat with it in her lap until the parking lot was empty. Gerald had given her 14 acres of nothing. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting in that car in the November cold, was that the nothing had a floor, and under that floor a wall, and inside that wall something that had been waiting longer than her marriage, longer than her grief, longer than anything Gerald had ever given her or taken away. But that was still 3 hours north. First, she had to decide whether to drive. The deed said Black Ridge Valley. It did not say how long the road would stop being a road. She drove north on Route 2 with the radio off. The silence was not comfortable, and she did not try to make it comfortable. Outside, the November fields ran flat and gray on both sides of the highway, the kind of landscape that does not ask anything of you, and she was grateful for that. 40 minutes out of the city, she passed through Millhaven. She had not planned to. The route simply went through it, the same route she and Gerald had driven every Sunday morning for the 3 years they lived there, before the children, before the house in Crestwood, before the life that had just been divided by a judge with kind eyes and no useful opinions. The diner was still there. Corner of Aldrich and Main, the same yellow curtains in the window, the same hand-lettered sign above the door that Gerald had always said looked like it was painted by someone's nephew. It probably had been. The lights were on inside. A man in a work jacket was sitting at the counter with both hands around a mug. Dorothy's foot came off the accelerator. She did not stop. But she slowed down enough to see the curtains clearly, the way the morning light came through them, yellow on yellow, the way it always had. Gerald, 1986, sliding a coffee across the table before she'd told him how she took it. 2 sugars, no cream, he had guessed correctly, and he'd smiled like that meant something. She was 29 years old, and she had thought without drama, without ceremony, this is the person I want to grow old beside. She had been right about him once. That was the part no one talked about in divorce court. That there had been a version of him worth choosing, that she had not been foolish to choose it. He had probably told himself in the years since that he deserved more than a life that had stopped surprising him. She supposed in his position she might have thought the same thing. That was the part that cost the most to admit. She pressed the accelerator and drove through Millhaven without stopping. Her phone rang at the 2-hour mark. Nora. Dorothy answered on the second ring. Her daughter's voice was careful, the specific carefulness that meant she had rehearsed this, that she was worried Dorothy would argue that she had decided something and was delivering it as gently as possible. Mom, my guest room has its own bathroom. You'd have your own space. You don't have to do this to prove anything to anyone. Dorothy watched the road. A long straight stretch, the fields giving way to the first low hills, the sky beginning to press down with the particular weight of mountain weather still 100 miles ahead. I know, sweetheart, she said. She knew the exit for Nora's neighborhood. She had looked it up 3 weeks ago, sitting at the kitchen table of the house that was no longer hers, just in case. The exit was 4 miles ahead. She had memorized the number. Her hands stayed on the wheel. Mom, I'll call you when I arrive. She ended the call and looked at the phone for 1 moment. Nora's name still on the screen, the call timer frozen at 1 minute. 12 seconds, and set it face down on the passenger seat, next to the printed directions she had annotated in her own handwriting the night before. She had printed the directions because she did not trust the GPS to know where she was going. She had been right about that, too. The signal had dropped 40 minutes ago. The road changed around the third hour. Pavement to chip seal to gravel to something the map on her phone when it briefly reconnected, labeled only as an unimproved track. The trees came closer. The sky narrowed. The ruts in the road were deep and frozen, and her car moved through them slowly, the way you move through something that is not trying to stop you, but is not making it easy either. Then the sign. Metal mounted on two wooden posts, the lower corners eaten through with rust. The lettering still legible: Callahan property, no trespassing. Dorothy stopped the car. She read the sign. All of it, though, there was not much to read. She thought about the 38 years the name Callahan had meant her children, her home, her signature on every school form and medical record and Christmas card for nearly 4 decades. She put the car in drive. The sign passed her window and disappeared in the rearview mirror. She had been a Callahan for 38 years. She supposed she still was just not the kind the sign had in mind. She smelled it before she saw it, the particular decay of wood that has been wet for years, without ever drying out, layered underneath with something older, animal and dark, the smell of a place that had stopped waiting for people and made other arrangements. The track ended at a small clearing. Dorothy stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking through the windshield at what Gerald had called a property. It was smaller than she had pictured, and worse. A log cabin maybe 30 feet across, listing slightly to the left, where the foundation had settled unevenly into the hillside. The porch roof had partially collapsed on the near side. One support beam rotted through at the base, the whole structure leaning against the exterior wall, like something that had given up standing on its own. Several windows were empty, not broken, just gone, the frames dark and open to whatever came in. Vines had worked their way up the east wall and across part of the roof, patient and indifferent, doing what vines do. Dorothy turned off the engine. She got out of the car and walked toward the porch. The first step took her weight without complaint. The second shifted under her foot, not dramatically, just a soft give a compression, the sound of wood that has forgotten what it was made for. She tested the third step before putting her full weight on it and felt the surface flex in a way that boards are not supposed to flex. She crossed the porch carefully, one hand on the wall, and pushed open the front door. The smell was worse inside. Wet timber and mold and the specific staleness of air that has not moved in years. Light came through a hole in the roof, a clean, slanted shaft of late-afternoon sun cutting across the interior and illuminating a section of collapsed wall on the far side, plaster and lath, and something dark behind it that might have been insulation or might have been something else entirely. Wind moved through a gap she could not locate, a low sound almost below hearing, more felt than heard. Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked at it. She had nowhere else to go. She unloaded the car before dark. The sleeping bag, the camping stove, 2 boxes of supplies from the hardware store in Garnet Falls where she had stopped on the way through, cleaning supplies, work gloves, a flashlight, batteries, 3 boxes of matches, a change of clothes. The photograph of Nora at 22 turning to find her in the graduation crowd, hand raised. She laid the sleeping bag on the section of floor that looked most solid near the stone fireplace. The fireplace drew well enough. She tested it with a small fire of broken porch wood, watched the smoke go up and not come back, and felt something that was not quite relief but was in the same neighborhood. By 9 o'clock, the cold had settled in completely. It came through the empty window frames and through the gap in the wall, and up through the floorboards from the frozen ground below, and it did not leave. Dorothy lay in the sleeping bag in all her clothes and listened to the cabin move around her, the small sounds of timber contracting in the cold, the wind finding new gaps. Something in the far corner that she chose not to investigate tonight. She had brought a book. She did not open it. At some point she slept. She did not know when. She woke at 2 in the morning because the flashlight had gone out. Complete darkness. The fire had burned down to nothing. No light from the windows, heavy cloud cover, no moon. She lay still and looked up at where the ceiling was, though she could not see it. The darkness was not frightening. It was empty. The way a room feels after everything has been moved out of it, not threatening, just vacated. All the furniture of her life gone. The house, the Sunday mornings, the retirement account with both their names on it, that had become in the language of the court, primarily his income. The version of Gerald who had guessed 2 sugars and no cream and smiled like it meant something. Gone. 38 years. And it ended here. She did not cry loudly. She was not that kind of crier, had never been. It was just water, steady and quiet, running from the corners of her eyes into her hair, and she lay still and let it because there was nothing else to do with it, and nowhere else to put it, and it seemed in the dark like the most honest thing she had done in months. At some point, it stopped. She lay still for a while longer. The darkness was the same. The cold was the same. The sounds of the cabin were the same. Then she thought the floor needs to come up in the corner by the east wall. The boards are rotted through. That's the first thing. She did not know where the thought came from. She did not examine it. She just held it in the dark and let it be there alongside everything else. She slept again. Dawn came through this hole in the roof, gray and specific, not beautiful, just light arriving, because that is what light does. Dorothy's breath was visible. Her hands, when she pulled them out of the sleeping bag, were stiff at the knuckles, slow to open. She sat up and looked at the room. It was worse in daylight. At night, she had only been able to see what the flashlight touched. Now she could see all of it. The collapsed wall, the water staining on the ceiling beams, the section of floor near the east wall that had rotted through entirely the dark gap where the boards had given way. The vines she had seen from outside had come through one of the empty window frames and were making their way unhurried across the interior sill. She stood up. Her back ached from the floor. Her feet were cold inside her boots. She looked at the section of rotted flooring near the east wall, crouched down, worked her fingers under the edge of one board and pulled. It came up in pieces, soft and dark, smelling of the ground beneath it. She looked at the piece in her hands for a moment, what it was, what it had been, what it was good for now. She threw it out the front door. Then she reached for the next one. The second piece of rotted board was heavier. She threw it further. By the 4th morning, she had a system. Coffee first, on the camping stove, sitting on the second porch step, the one that was still solid. She had tested every step on the first day, and this was the one she trusted. She sat there with both hands around the mug, while the light came up over the tree line, and she looked at whatever needed doing that day, and then she went and did it. It was not a ritual. She was not interested in rituals. It was simply the difference between starting and not starting, and she had learned in the first 3 days that the difference mattered more than she had expected. The work was not elegant. She had watched enough videos on her phone propped against the camping stove in the evenings, the screen, the brightest thing in the cabin, to know the correct sequence, assess, clear, clean, then repair. She was still in the clearing and cleaning phase. The mold on the east wall had penetrated deep into the timber in 2 places. The floor joists under the section she had already pulled up were soft in ways that suggested the problem went further than she could currently see. She worked through it methodically, one section at a time, each day a little further. By day 4, the blisters on her palms had stopped hurting. They were hardening, flattening, becoming something she did not yet have a word for. She noticed this one morning, while wrapping her hands around the coffee mug, the way the ceramic felt different against the skin, less sensitive, more solid. She did not think of it as strength. She thought of it as information. Her hands were learning the work. Nora called on the 6th day. Her daughter's voice had lost the careful, rehearsed quality it had carried on the drive north. This time it was direct, which meant she was more frightened. "Mom, I looked it up. Average January temperature in Black Ridge Valley is 19 degrees. 19. Do you have insulation? Do you have a working stove?" Dorothy was scraping mold off the east wall with a wide putty knife, working in long downward strokes, the respirator mask she'd bought in Garnet Falls fogging slightly with each exhale. "I have a camping stove and a very good coat," she said. "That's not funny." "No," Dorothy said. "It isn't." A pause. She could hear Nora deciding whether to push further the particular silence of a person weighing words. "I just need to know you're okay." "I'm working," Dorothy said. "That's as okay as I know how to be right now." She ended the call and set the phone on the windowsill and went back to the wall. Nora was not wrong to be frightened. 19 degrees was 19 degrees, and the cabin's insulation, what remained of it, was not adequate for what was coming. Dorothy had priced out spray foam insulation at the hardware store and set the brochure aside and not yet decided. There were things she could not yet afford to think about, and things she could not afford not to think about, and the line between them shifted daily. She scraped. The east wall took most of the morning. By early afternoon, she had moved to the kitchen section, a shorter wall, narrower, running between the main room and what had once been a small pantry. The mold here was lighter, which was unexpected. The wood beneath it, when she scraped down to it, was drier than the rest. Older, possibly. The logs here were a slightly different diameter than the surrounding wall, as though they had been replaced at some point or added. She knocked on the wall to test for soft spots. Solid. She moved 6 inches to the left and knocked again. Hollow. She stopped. She knocked the solid section again. A dense, flat sound, timber all the way through. She knocked the hollow section. A different sound, entirely lighter, with a faint resonance behind it, the sound of a space where there should not be a space. She stood still with her knuckles resting against the wall. Knocked the solid section. Knocked the hollow section. Not her imagination. She looked across the room at the crowbar leaning against the opposite wall. She looked back at the kitchen wall. She looked at the window, the afternoon light coming through at a low angle, going fast. The way light goes in November in Montana, without warning and without apology. The crowbar was cold when she picked it up. She hadn't noticed until that moment how cold everything was and how little it was stopping her. She looked at the wall. She looked at the light. She set the flat end of the crowbar into the gap between 2 logs and held it there, not yet pushing, just held it, feeling the weight of the tool in her changed hands, in the fading light, in the silence of the cabin that had been keeping whatever was behind this wall for longer than she had been alive. The wood gave on the 3rd strike, not with a crack, just a slow, tired yielding the way old things do when they have been waiting long enough. Dorothy worked the crowbar along the gap, prying in small increments the way the YouTube video had shown her. The logs here were older than the surrounding wall dryer, and they came apart with less resistance than she expected, not rotten, just exhausted, the fibers separating along lines they had been holding for a very long time. The cavity opened gradually. First a gap, then a darkness behind the gap, then, as she removed the 2nd and 3rd log, a space. 2 feet deep, floor to ceiling. Running the full height of the kitchen wall hidden behind the outer layer of timber as deliberately as a room within a room. She stood back and looked at it. Then she turned on her flashlight and looked into it. The cavity was empty except for the floor. And on the floor, set precisely in the center of the space as though placed there with some care, was a box. Cedar. Approximately the size of a large shoebox, the wood still pale and close-grained, the corners still tight. Around it, the cavity walls showed the staining and discoloration of decades of temperature change. The box itself showed none of it. Cedar resists. That is what it does, resists moisture, resists insects, resists the patient work of time that had reduced everything else in this cabin to something requiring replacement. Someone had known that when they chose it. Dorothy crouched down and reached into the cavity and got both hands under the box. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it out carefully, the way you carry something when you do not yet know what it contains, and set it on the section of floor she had already cleared and relaid her floorboards she had chosen and set herself. She sat down beside it. She did not open it immediately. She looked at it for a long moment in the beam of the flashlight. Cedar intact, clean, sitting in the middle of a cabin that had been deteriorating for 30 years, in a wall that had been sealed for longer than that, in a valley that most people had never heard of, and no one had thought worth visiting. Someone had hidden this. Someone had kept this safe. Someone had believed for over 100 years that this was worth keeping. She undid the small brass latch. It moved stiffly, but it moved. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job without complaint for longer than she had been alive, were documents. A cloth pouch, the drawstring still intact. A glass vial stoppered with wax that had dried and darkened, but had not cracked. And beneath everything, a hand-drawn map on heavy paper, the lines still precise, the annotations still legible in a small, careful hand. Dorothy lifted out the top document and unfolded it. It was a co-claim registration. Blackridge County Land Office. Filed in the spring of 1879. The claim was for a mineral spring located on the north-facing slope of the property, described in the attached survey, the water of which had been tested and found to contain iron, sulfur, and trace minerals consistent with therapeutic properties documented at similar springs in the Montana Territory. 2 names at the bottom. Jonas Callahan, primary claimant. Agnes Pruitt, co-claimant. Dorothy read the rest of the documents in order. Engineering sketches for a bathhouse, modest, practical, drawn by someone who understood both aesthetics and construction. Letters from 3 potential investors in Billings and Helena, expressing interest, requesting further information about water yield and seasonal access. A hand-drawn survey of the north slope with the spring location marked and the proposed bathhouse footprint overlaid in a different ink added later. And at the bottom of the box, folded separately from the rest, a single piece of paper. A note, not a document. Handwritten, the letters formed with the slight irregularity of someone writing quickly or writing tired. Season too late to break ground. Soil frozen through. Will build in spring. Materials already ordered from Billings. The water is worth it, A. Agrees. J.C. October 1879. Dorothy held the note for a long time. He never came back. But she had. She set the note down carefully on top of the other documents and sat in the silence of the cabin with the flashlight beam on the open cedar box and the oilcloth spread beside her, and 145 years of someone else's interrupted intention laid out on the floor she had rebuilt with her own hands. The cloth pouch contained mineral samples, small rocks labeled in the same careful handwriting as the survey annotations. The glass vial contained liquid dark amber through the old glass sealed against the world since 1879. Spring water. It had to be. Dorothy set the vial down very carefully. She picked up the co-claim registration again. Read it through to the end. At the bottom, beside Jonas Callahan's signature, the second name was written in a different hand, smaller, more deliberate, the hand of someone who understood that a signature on a legal document was not a casual thing. Agnes Pruitt, co-claimant. The ink was faded, but the letters were clear. Dorothy read it twice. Then she read it again. She looked up at the ceiling, the flashlight beam moving with her crossing the old timber, the water stains, the places where the roof had been repaired, and the places where it still needed to be. The cabin was quiet around her. Outside, the wind had dropped. The only sound was the small sound of the documents settling in the cold air. Agnes Pruitt had put her name on a legal document in 1879, and then, as far as Dorothy could tell, had disappeared from the record entirely. No further mention in the co-claim file. No follow-up correspondence. Just the signature, careful and deliberate, and then nothing. Dorothy did not yet know what that name would cost her. She only knew that it was there, had been there in this box, in this wall, in this cabin, that her husband had handed her as a joke, and that she was the first person in 145 years to read it by flashlight on a December night in Montana, and understand that it mattered. The 1879 survey used chains and links, a measuring system that had not been in common use for 60 years. Dorothy converted the coordinates by hand 3 times, checking her arithmetic against itself. She did this at a corner table in Vera's Diner in Garnet Falls, the only establishment in the valley with reliable Wi-Fi, and the only place within 40 minutes where she could sit for 2 hours without anyone asking her to leave or explain herself. She came in the evenings after the workday was done with the survey documents in a manila folder and her laptop and a legal pad for the conversions. Vera refilled her coffee without being asked. Did not inquire about the documents or the legal pad or the calculations Dorothy crossed out and redid. Did not offer opinions or sympathy or the particular kind of helpful attention that requires something in return. She simply kept the coffee coming and left Dorothy to her work, and Dorothy found sitting in that corner booth night after night that this was one of the kindest things anyone had done for her in months. She did not need to be assessed. She needed coffee and a table and Wi-Fi. Vera provided these without making them into anything more than what they were. The converted coordinates put the spring on the north-facing slope of the property, approximately 230 feet northeast of the cabin, in a section of mixed pine and open ground where the tree cover thinned toward a small natural clearing. Dorothy walked it for the first time on a Thursday. She got it wrong. The ground in the clearing was frozen solid, no moisture, no warmth. She walked the perimeter twice and then stood in the center with the survey map and looked at the tree line and accepted that her conversion was off somewhere and walked back to the cabin. She recalculated that evening at Vera's, found the error a transcription mistake in the third conversion, a 6 where there should have been a 9. Vera refilled the coffee. Dorothy did not explain. She walked it again on Friday. Got closer, she could feel it in the way the ground changed texture underfoot in one section. A slight softness beneath the frozen surface, a give that the surrounding ground did not have. But she could not find the source, and the light went before she could work it out properly. Saturday morning she went back before breakfast. The snow on the north slope was uneven. This was normal. Snow is always uneven on slopes, catching differently against trees and rocks and variations in elevation. But in one area, a rough circle maybe 12 feet across the snow was thinner than it should have been. Not melted entirely, just reduced as though something beneath it was working quietly against the cold. Dorothy stopped. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the snow inside the circle. Held it there. Warmer. Not dramatically. Not unmistakably at first. Just less cold than it should have been, given the air temperature and the time of morning and the depth of the snow everywhere else on this slope. She cleared the snow from a small area with her forearm and pressed both hands against the bare ground. Warmer. She dug with her hands. The ground was cold and resistant at the surface, but softened faster than it should have as she went deeper. 4 inches, 6. At 8 inches, her fingers met moisture. Not standing water, just saturated soil, the ground holding more water than the surrounding area at the same depth. She dug further. At 10 inches, water seeped in. It was warm. Dorothy sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. The water on her fingers was steaming faintly in the cold air, a barely visible rise gone almost as soon as it formed, but there. She put both hands back into the hole and held them in the water, and felt the warmth moving against her palms, and between her fingers, and up into her wrists, and she did not speak, and she did not reach for her phone, and she did not call anyone. The snow around her was white and still. The pines at the edge of the clearing held their silence. Somewhere below her hands the water moved through the ground, the way it had been moving for 145 years through Jonas Callahan's death and Agnes Pruitt's silence, and 30 years of no one and every season between then and now, indifferent to all of it, present through all of it, going nowhere. A faint smell reached her. Mineral, faintly sulfuric, the smell of deep earth and old water, and something she had no prior experience of, but recognized anyway, the way you recognize certain things, not because you have encountered them before, but because some part of you has been waiting to. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the wax-sealed vial. She set it in the snow beside the hole. The old glass and the new water side by side in the January cold, 145 years between them, and no distance at all. Agnes Pruitt had believed in this ground. Now so did she. She had 72 hours. The envelope sat on the table she had built from the cabin's own timber, and she left it there overnight, as though it might explain itself by morning. It did not explain itself. In the morning it was still there, white rectangular, forwarded through the Blackridge County Recorder's office in an outer envelope that someone had typed her name on without knowing anything about her. Inside 3 pages of legal language and a single fact that did not require a law degree to understand. Agnes Pruitt had never signed a release of her interest in the property. Dorothy read the letter twice at the table she had built in the cabin she had spent 3 months rebuilding 40 feet from the spring she had found on her knees in the January snow. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the north slope and sat with what it meant. Hazel Pruitt was 61 years old and lived in Bozeman, and had spent 2 years researching her grandmother's history. She was not asking for much, her attorney's language implied, while asking for everything 50% of the property's assessed value or a jointly agreed sale. Respond within 72 hours. Dorothy drove to the county seat the next morning. Walt's office was above Calder's Hardware on Main Street, accessible by an exterior staircase that had been repaired recently enough that the new boards still showed against the weathered ones. Walt himself was 67, semi-retired, the kind of attorney who had handled every variety of human problem in a small county for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by any of them. His office smelled of old coffee and case files, and the particular patience of a man who had learned to deliver bad news without making it worse. He read the letter carefully, asked 2 questions, read it again. His assessment was honest and took 11 minutes. Agnes Pruitt's unresolved co-claim was a genuine legal gray area. Dormant for 145 years, yes, but dormancy was not the same as extinguishment, and Hazel's attorney clearly knew that. Dorothy could contest it. Walt would not discourage her from contesting it. But she should understand 18 months minimum, more likely 2 years. Legal fees that would require borrowing against the property she was trying to protect. And no guarantee a judge could find either way on a question this old and this unresolved. Dorothy looked at the window above Walt's desk. The hardware store parking lot below. A man loading lumber into a truck, the boards going in one at a time, with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She thanked Walt, paid his consultation fee in cash, drove back to Blackridge Valley on the same road she had driven north on 4 months ago when the deed had been a joke and the cabin had been a ruin, and she had not yet known that the ground beneath the north slope was warm. She sat at her table for a long time after she got back. The letter was still there. She moved it to the side and set a blank piece of paper in front of her and picked up a pen, not her phone, not her laptop. A pen, the same one she used to annotate the survey documents, and she started to write. She did not write a legal response. She wrote to Hazel Pruitt the way she would write to anyone she needed to tell the truth to. She described finding the cedar box, the oilcloth, the documents inside the co-claim registration, the engineering sketches, the investor letters, the note in JC's handwriting that said, "We'll build in spring," and had been waiting 145 years for someone to read it. She described Agnes Pruitt's signature careful, deliberate, the signature of a woman who understood that putting her name on a legal document was not a casual act. She described the spring, the early melt circle in the January snow, both hands in the warm water. The vial she had carried out to the north slope and set in the snow beside the hole she had dug. She wrote, "Your grandmother believed in this place. She put her name on a document, and her work into a plan, and her faith into a piece of ground that no one else thought was worth the trouble. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know why she went quiet. But I know what she knew. I found it in the wall of this cabin where she or someone who cared about her work put it for safekeeping." She paused, looked at Agnes Pruitt's name on the co-claim document, which she had set beside the blank paper when she sat down, the same name she had read 3 times in December by flashlight on the cabin floor. She looked at it differently now. Agnes Pruitt had believed in this land. Nobody had listened to her either. Dorothy picked up the pen. "Before we decide anything about ownership," she wrote, "I think you should come and see what your grandmother knew about this place. Come and see it before either of us decides what it's worth." She did not revise it. She did not pass it through Walt, or soften the language, or add a disclaimer. She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, wrote Hazel Pruitt's address from the attorney's letterhead, and sealed it. She sealed the envelope before she could revise it into something more careful. No legal language. No attorney's signature. Just her name and an invitation that might cost her everything, or might not. She set it on the table beside the original letter, and looked at both of them for a moment. Hazel Pruitt's attorney's careful language, and her own handwriting side by side on the table she had built from the cabin's own timber. Then she put on her coat and went out to work on the north wall, because the north wall still needed work, and 72 hours was 72 hours, and she was not going to spend them waiting. Hazel Pruitt drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear bumper. Dorothy noticed that before she noticed anything else. She had been recalking the gap between the new window frame and the log wall when the car appeared at the end of the gravel track, moving carefully over the ruts, the way people move when they are not sure what they are driving toward. Dorothy set down the caulking gun and watched from the porch. Hazel got out of the car and did not immediately look at Dorothy. She looked at the cabin. She stood beside the open car door and looked at it the way you look at something when what you are seeing does not match what you prepared yourself to see. The rebuilt porch, the new windows, the re-chinked walls, the gaps between the logs filled and sealed against the coming winter. The garden bed Dorothy had turned along the south wall, still bare but edged and ready. The stacked timber under the lean-to at the side of the building, cut and split and covered against the weather. It did not look like a legal dispute. It looked like someone's work. 3 months of it specific and accumulating, the kind of work that changes a place and changes the person doing it in equal measure. Hazel closed the car door. She was 61, solidly built, wearing hiking boots that had seen serious use, and a canvas jacket with a library system logo on the breast pocket faded from washing. No attorney, no briefcase. Just a woman who had driven 4 hours from Bozeman to see something she had only read about in a letter written by hand. She walked toward the porch and looked up at Dorothy and said, "You wrote that Agnes's handwriting was still legible." "It is," Dorothy said. "Come in." She made coffee on the propane stove while Hazel sat at the table Dorothy had built and looked around the interior without commenting. The cedar box was already open on the table. Dorothy had set it out that morning, arranged the documents in the order she had found them, set the vial and the cloth pouch to one side. Hazel looked at the box first, then at the documents. She did not touch anything until Dorothy sat down across from her and nodded. She picked up the co-claim registration first, read it through slowly, set it down, and picked up the survey map with Agnes's annotations in the margins. The small, careful notations in pencil measurements and observations, recorded by someone who was doing the work and not being credited for it. She looked at the handwriting for a long time. "She was a surveyor's assistant," Hazel said finally. "I knew that from the county employment records. She worked for the Black Ridge County Land Office from 1876 to 1881. I knew she'd worked with Jonas Callahan on several surveys." She paused, looked at the annotations again. "I didn't know she'd filed a co-claim. I didn't know she believed in it this much." Her voice did not break, but something in it changed, a quality that had been held in place by the long discipline of not knowing, releasing slightly like a knot that has been tight for a very long time and has just been given permission to loosen. She kept this quiet for 60 years. Dorothy understood that kind of quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who had understood early and completely that saying it would cost more than keeping it. Agnes Pruitt had put her name on a legal document, and her measurements in the survey margins and her faith in a piece of ground. And then she had gone quiet, and the ground had gone on without her. And here was her granddaughter's granddaughter, sitting at a table built from the cabin's own timber, looking at the handwriting for the first time. "There's something else," Dorothy said. She took Hazel out to the north slope in the late afternoon, when the light came through the pines at the low angle that made the steam above the spring visible from 20 feet away. Hazel saw it before Dorothy pointed it out, stopped walking, and stood still and looked at the faint rise of vapor above the excavated area. They walked to the edge together. The water caught the light the way water does when it is moving, shifting, and specific, never the same twice. The mineral smell was there, faint and particular, the smell of deep ground. Hazel crouched down and held her hand above the water without touching it, feeling the warmth. She stayed that way for a long time. When she stood up, she looked at the slope around them, the tree line, the clearing, the way the land fell away to the south toward the cabin. She was reading it the way her grandmother had read it in 1879, Dorothy thought, looking at the same ground through inherited eyes. "I don't want money," Hazel said. Her voice was even. She had clearly been thinking about this longer than the drive from Bozeman. "I want her name on it. Somewhere real. Somewhere that stays." Dorothy looked at her. "She's already on the sign," she said. She had not planned to say it that way as a fact, rather than an offer as something already true, rather than something being proposed. But it was true. She had decided it weeks ago, alone in the cabin, on an evening when she was drawing rough sketches of what the bathhouse might look like, and she had written Agnes Pruitt in the margin of the sketch, without deliberating about it, the way you write down something you have already settled. Hazel looked at her. "What sign?" "The one I haven't made yet," Dorothy said. "But I know what it will say. Black Ridge Mineral Spring. Originally claimed 1879 by Jonas Callahan and Agnes Pruitt. Restored 2024. She paused. Her name in the same size as everything else. Not a footnote. Hazel was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the spring. The water moved in the late light, warm and unhurried. She would have wanted that, Hazel said. Not to Dorothy specifically. To the slope, to the trees, to the ground her grandmother had surveyed and measured and believed in, and then gone quiet about for the rest of her life. They stood at the edge of the spring for a long time without speaking. The water was warm and faintly mineral in the cold air. Agnes Pruitt had stood somewhere near this spot in 1879 and believed it was worth something. She had been right. It had just taken 145 years for anyone to agree with her. Nora arrived the way she had always arrived, when she was afraid of being talked out of something without calling first. Dorothy was on the roof when the rental car appeared at the end of the gravel track. She was resealing the flashing joint above the north-facing eave, both hands occupied, but she heard the tires on the gravel and looked up and saw the car moving carefully over the ruts. She recognized the way Nora parked slightly crooked, not quite parallel to the track, the way she had parked in every driveway since she was 17 and had never corrected. Nora got out of the car. She did not look at Dorothy immediately. She looked at the cabin, the rebuilt porch, the new railing, the windows with glass in every frame, the rechinked walls tight and even. The garden bed along the south wall turned and edged bare in the late-season cold, but clearly intentional, the work of someone planning for spring. Nora stood beside her car and looked at all of it. Then she looked up at her mother on the roof. Dorothy looked back down. Neither of them spoke. The distance between them, Dorothy 12 feet up on the roof slope, Nora standing in the gravel below, was not very far. It felt for that moment like the truest picture of where they had both arrived. Dorothy came down from the roof. She made soup for dinner on the propane stove using the cast-iron pan she had brought from the house on Crestwood Avenue. Nora sat at the table Dorothy had built and was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet, not preparing a response, just looking. She looked at the walls, the floor, the shelves Dorothy had cut and mounted above the east window. She ran her hand along the edge of the table. "Mom," Dorothy stirred the soup. "I told you this was impossible." Dorothy set the spoon down and turned around. Nora was looking at the table under her hand. Not at Dorothy. The way you look at something when the words are hard and you need somewhere to put your eyes. "I was wrong." Not an apology. An apology has a shape-offer acceptance resolution. This was 3 words that had required 9 hours of driving and 4 months of being wrong to get to, and Nora said them without decoration and left them on the table between them. Dorothy brought the soup over and sat down. They ate. The cabin was warm. Outside, the last light left the sky and the pines became silhouettes, and the stars came up over the ridge with the particular brightness of stars at elevation far from any city. Dorothy told her about Agnes Pruitt, about Hazel, about the spring and the cedar box, and the engineering sketches for a bathhouse drawn in 1879 by someone who had understood both form and function and had never gotten to build what she planned. She told her about the nights in January when she had almost called Walt to say she was done, the specific February night when the propane line froze and she spent 3 hours in the cold working out how to thaw it. Nora listened without interrupting, both hands around her bowl. This was new. "There's something I want to tell you," Dorothy said. "Something I haven't said to anyone." Nora looked up. "I stopped thinking about your father around the 3rd week." Dorothy looked at the east window, the first window she had fixed, the one that caught the morning light. Not at Nora. Outward toward the dark where the spring was. Not because it stopped hurting. It still hurt. But there was too much to do, and the work was mine. She paused. "Everything in this room I put here. Every wall in this cabin I fixed. Every board in this floor I chose. The words settled the way words settle when they have been true for a long time and are only now being spoken aloud. Nothing I built here had anything to do with proving something to him. I don't think it ever did. Nora's eyes had gone bright. She looked at the table under her hands. The table Dorothy had built from timber salvaged from the cabin's own collapsed interior wall on a February afternoon when it was 11 degrees outside and Dorothy had needed something to do with her hands. That was when she understood that she had already won before the spring, before the documents, before any of it. The silence between them was not distance. It was the first silence in years that felt like rest. After a while, Nora said, "Tell me about the bathhouse." Dorothy told her. The 3 soaking rooms, small and functional. The sign with Agnes Pruitt's name in the same size as everything else. Nora pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket and started writing practical questions and architect's questions about drainage and freeze depth and load-bearing. Dorothy answered what she knew and said plainly what she didn't. They sat at the table until late. The stove burned low. Dorothy added wood without getting up from the conversation. Later, after Nora had gone to sleep in the loft, Dorothy sat alone by the stove. She thought about Gerald for the first time in months. She thought about him and felt only the mild, fading recognition of someone she used to know well in a different life that had led by strange and necessary roads to this one. She finished the coffee, banked the stove, climbed to the loft carefully so as not to wake her daughter, and was asleep before she had time to think about anything else. The sign was smaller than she'd pictured it. The names were right. She had made it herself from a length of clear pine she had set aside in October when she first started thinking about what the finished place would need. The lettering she had routed by hand slowly over 3 evenings at the workbench she had built along the north wall of the lean-to. She had made mistakes on 2 practice boards before she got the depth and spacing right on the 3rd. Blackridge Mineral Spring, originally claimed 1879 by Jonas Callahan and Agnes Pruitt. Restored 2024. Agnes Pruitt's name in the same size as everything else. Not smaller, not italicized, not a subordinate clause. The same. Dorothy stood in front of it on the morning the bathhouse opened and looked at it for a moment, and then went back inside to make sure the towels were folded and the wood stove in the changing room was drawing properly. Vera arrived at 9 o'clock. She came the way she came to everything, without announcement, without ceremony, with a folded towel under one arm and a thermos of coffee under the other, wearing the same canvas jacket she wore behind the counter at the diner. She pulled into the gravel area beside the bathhouse and got out, and looked at the sign, and then looked at Dorothy standing in the doorway. "Nice sign," she said. "Thank you," Dorothy said. "Come in." Vera was not a journalist. She had not read about Dorothy in any publication. She did not know the details of the divorce or the courtroom, or the deed handed over with a shared smile. She knew Dorothy as the woman who came into the diner in the evenings with a folder of documents and a legal pad, and drank 2 cups of coffee and worked without needing to be talked to. She had come because Dorothy had built something, and she wanted to use it. Dorothy showed her the first soaking room, the cedar tub, the mineral water piped in from the spring, at a temperature that required no adjustment, the small window that looked out toward the tree line, and the slope where the spring was. Vera looked at all of it without saying very much. Then set her towel on the bench and her thermos on the shelf Dorothy had mounted beside the window and said, "I'll let you know how it is." And Dorothy closed the door and stood in the changing room corridor and listened to the quiet. This was what it sounded like when something was working. Not applause, not confirmation, just a door closing and water running, and a person making use of what she had built. She had not known until this moment how much she had needed to hear exactly that. That evening after Vera had gone, and the fire in the changing room wood stove had burned to coals, and the mineral spring was running in the dark the way it had always run, Dorothy walked through the cabin. She was not inspecting. She had inspected it many times. She knew every repair, every replacement, every decision she had made and remade over 6 months of work. This was something else, a different kind of moving through a space, slower the way you move through something that belongs to you, not on paper, but in the body. She touched the east wall where she had scraped the mold in the first week, the logs now clean and sealed solid under her palm. She touched the window frame she had planed down and reset in February, the wood fitted close against the glass. She walked the length of the floor she had relaid board by board, her footsteps even on timber she had chosen, and placed herself. She was not remembering achievements. She was remembering mornings, the specific mornings, when she had not been certain the work would hold, when the next step had not been clear, when the only available decision was to do the next small thing and find out. She stopped at the section of floor near the east wall. The first boards she had replaced back in December, the morning after the night the flashlight died, and she had lain in the dark for a long time, and then in the dark thought the floor needs to come up in the corner by the east wall. She crouched down and set her hand flat on the board. She remembered the morning she'd set this one in. Her hands hadn't been shaking anymore by then. The wood was warm under her hand, warmer than the air around it. The way worked wood holds heat. She had placed this board herself one February afternoon, when she still wasn't certain any of it would hold. It had held. She stayed there for a moment, with her palm flat on the floor of the cabin she had rebuilt in the valley where Agnes Pruitt had surveyed a mineral spring in 1879 and believed it was worth something on the land that Gerald had handed her as a joke on a Tuesday in November, when he believed he was giving her nothing. Then she stood up, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow the bathhouse would open again. There was still work to do on the lean-to roof before the first heavy snow. Nora had sent 3 pages of notes about the drainage system that Dorothy needed to read. She fell asleep quickly, the way she always did, now the sleep of a person whose body had been used well and whose mind had run out of things to resist. Nora came back on a Saturday in April unannounced, the way she came now when she was serious about something. Dorothy heard the tires on the gravel before she saw the car. She was on the front porch, kneeling beside the last original step, the one she had worked around for 8 months, replacing everything above it and below it and on either side of it without ever quite getting to it. She had told herself it was because she was saving the best lumber. She had known without examining it that the reason was something else. Nora got out of the car and walked toward the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at the one original step remaining. She looked at the hammer in Dorothy's hand. She looked at her mother. "Can I do that?" Dorothy looked at her daughter for a moment, at the canvas jacket, the work gloves tucked into the pocket, the notebook that was not there this time. Just Nora. Just her hands. She held out the hammer. Nora took it. She looked at it the way you look at a tool when you know its purpose but have not yet developed the instinct for its weight. She crouched down beside the step, set the nail, pulled the hammer back, and swung. She missed. The hammer glanced off the nail head and struck the wood beside it, leaving a small dent in the surface of the new board. She adjusted her grip, set the nail again. The second swing hit clean, a good sound. Solid, certain, the sound of metal finding its mark. She hit it twice more to set it flush, the nail disappearing into the wood in the way that mean it has gone where it was meant to go. Dorothy stood beside her and did not correct her angle or her grip or the way she was holding her elbow. She stood beside her and let her daughter do the work. It took 4 minutes. When it was done, they both looked at it. The nail was slightly off-center, not enough to matter structurally enough to see if you were looking for it. The step was solid. Dorothy set her foot on it and put her weight down and felt it hold without any give at all. Nora stood up and set the hammer on the porch railing, not handing it back, not returning it, setting it down the way you set something down when you intend to pick it up again, when you are in some way you have not yet put into words, claiming a small, continuing right to it. Dorothy looked at the hammer on the railing. She had rebuilt the cabin. She had found the spring. She was still rebuilding herself, and she had stopped somewhere along the way, thinking of that as a problem to be solved. It was just a life. Her life. The one she had built. Some things once started do not need to be handed back. She looked at the step, at the small dent beside the nail where Nora had missed on the first swing, at her daughter standing on the porch in the April morning, with her hands at her sides, and something in her face that had not been there in November, a quality of presence of having arrived somewhere and recognized it. Dorothy did not say anything. She stepped off the porch onto the new step, her full weight no hesitation, and walked toward the tree line. The morning light came through the pines at a low angle, the particular light of early April at elevation, when the snow has gone from the south-facing slopes, but still holds in the shadows, and everything is in the process of becoming what it will be. She walked through it without looking back. Not because looking back would hurt, because what was ahead was where she was going. Behind her on the porch, Nora did not follow. Not yet. Behind her up the slope, the spring was running warm, iron-rich, unhurried the way it had run for 145 years, through everything that had happened above it. It had been here through Jonas Callahan's death, through Agnes Pruitt's silence, through 30 years of no one, and now through her. She walked toward it in the morning light, and the pines opened, and she kept going. There is a woman named Agnes Pruitt who filed a legal claim on a piece of ground in 1879 and was never heard from again on the subject. Her handwriting is still in the margins of the survey documents. Small, precise. The handwriting of someone who was paying close attention to things she would not be credited for. Dorothy Callahan found those documents in a cedar box inside a wall that had been sealed for 145 years. She found them because she had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose, and a crowbar in her changed hands, and enough stubbornness to keep going after the flashlight died. Agnes Pruitt's name is on the sign now. Same size as everything else. That is how it should have always been. If you have ever been handed something as an insult that turned out to be the thing that saved you, if you have ever been told it was too late, that the window had closed, that the person you used to be was the best version you were going to get, leave one word in the comments. Just one. Whatever word comes to mind when you think about starting over. And if this story found you at the right moment, if it landed somewhere true, share it with someone who needs to hear that the ground beneath them might be warmer than they think. The spring was always there. Sometimes it just takes the right person at the right moment of having nothing left to protect, to get down on their knees in the snow and dig,